When a disabled man is brutally assaulted by rogue police officers, his son, a lawyer working for the Department of Justice, faces an unjust legal system as he fights for his father's justice. But the deeper he dives into the battle, the more he uncovers dark secrets lurking behind a system that protects abusers. Will the truth ever be revealed? Will justice truly prevail? Join us on their harrowing journey to find out. Henry Dawson, a 75-year-old African-American man, sat in his familiar wheelchair, slowly rolling down the street in the late afternoon sun. The soft autumn light glistened on the pavement as he made his way home after a routine bank visit. Though his legs had been paralyzed in a military accident decades ago, Henry took pride in his independence and never wanted to burden anyone, not even his only son, David, who had offered to help many times. Today, however, something unexpected happened. As he turned a corner, two white police officers approached him, one tall with a bald head and the other shorter and stocky, both exuding a stern presence. Henry stopped his chair, feeling a slight tightening in his chest. The look in their eyes brought back memories of the many times he had faced discrimination throughout his life. Although he did not yet know why they were approaching, he sensed trouble brewing. "Hey, stop right there," barked the taller officer, his voice slicing through the quiet. Henry froze, looking up at the two men advancing toward him, their faces revealing no hint of friendliness. "Is something wrong, officer?" he asked calmly, his voice low and steady. "Show us your ID," the bald officer demanded, while his colleague stood behind him, arms crossed, eyeing Henry suspiciously, as if Henry had committed some sort of crime. Henry was taken aback. "ID?" He frowned but remained composed. "I haven't done anything wrong. We ask the questions, you answer," snapped the shorter officer impatiently. "Hand over your ID, old man." Despite the discomfort welling up inside him, Henry slowly reached into his bag and pulled out his identification, his hands shaking slightly, not only from age but from the anger rising within him. The bald officer snatched the ID from Henry without a word of thanks. He glanced at it, then turned to his partner with a sneer. "This Idaho doesn't look legit," he said mockingly. "Is this really yours?" Henry took a deep breath, looking directly into their eyes. "I've lived here for over 40 years. That Idaho is real." The shorter officer laughed mockingly, his smile devoid of warmth. "You don't look like someone who belongs here. What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Anger bubbled up inside Henry, but he restrained himself. He'd heard these kinds of racist remarks far too often. "I just came from the bank. I live in this neighborhood." "Bank?" the taller officer said derisively. "You must have withdrawn a lot of money. We should see what you have in that bag." Without waiting for Henry's response, he reached down and snatched the bag off his lap. Henry was stunned. "You have no right to do that," he yelled, anger boiling over. "That's my personal property." "We have every right," the bald officer replied coldly. "People like you need to learn to respect the law. People like you." Those words cut deep, like a punch to the soul. Henry had heard them countless times from people who neither understood nor cared to understand him, or people like him. But this time, it was more than just words, they were actively humiliating him. "I haven't done anything wrong," Henry said, his voice hardening. "You're abusing your power." The bald officer chuckled darkly, leaning down to meet Henry's gaze. "You're nobody," he whispered menacingly. "And now you'll pay for that." Before Henry could respond, the shorter officer stepped forward, grabbed the handles of Henry's wheelchair, and shoved him hard. Henry lurched forward, clutching the armrests in a desperate attempt to steady himself. "Let go of me," Henry shouted, but his voice was swallowed up by the cold air as the officers laughed cruelly. Henry felt himself being dragged toward a patrol car. His strength was fading, but his dignity burned bright. He gripped the armrests tightly, his gaze steely and forward, refusing to let himself be broken. Meanwhile, in a small office within the U.S. Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., David Dawson sat at his computer, finishing the day's reports. As a top investigator in corruption and abuse cases within the justice system, David had built a stellar career. At 35, he was already one of the department's leading attorneys. People often said David inherited his father's strength and resilience. Henry had always taught David that justice never came easily and to stand up for what's right, even in the face of oppression. The phone on David's desk rang, interrupting his thoughts. He glanced at the screen and saw the name of an old neighbor from his hometown. An unsettling feeling arose in his mind. "Hello, this is David," he answered, his voice tinged with worry. David, it's me, Marge, came the trembling voice on the other end. I don't know where to start. It's about your father, Henry. He's just been arrested by the police. Her words felt like a punch to his stomach. What? My dad? Can you tell me what happened? They took him, David. And they beat him, she said, her voice shaking with fear. I was there. We filmed it. And it was unprovoked. They just attacked him. David sat frozen in his chair, barely able to comprehend what he was hearing. His father, a peaceful, disabled man, had been arrested and beaten. How could this happen? What's his condition now? David asked urgently. They took him to the hospital, Marge replied. I think he's pretty badly hurt, but I'm not sure. The police said he resisted, but that's not true. We all saw it. He didn't do anything wrong. David's blood boiled, fury rising within him. Thank you, Marge, he said quickly, his voice tense. I'll be on the next flight out. 3 hours later, David was on a plane back to his hometown, his mind racing with worry and anger. He couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Why had the police arrested his father, and why had they assaulted a disabled elderly man? The more he thought, the more outraged he felt. When his plane landed, David headed straight to the hospital, his heart pounding as he rushed through the brightly lit halls. Where's my father? He asked the receptionist, his voice urgent. Mr. Henry Dawson is in the intensive care unit. On the 3rd floor, she replied. He's just undergone examination. He has quite a few injuries. David hurried to the elevator, pressing the button for the 3rd floor. When the doors opened, he saw several neighbors from his father's community sitting outside, including Marge. Their faces were lined with worry and sadness. Marge stood up as he approached, her eyes moist with tears. Your father is in there, but you should be prepared. Without another word, David pushed the door open. There on the bed lay Henry, his face bruised and swollen, one side of his mouth bloodied, his arm and shoulder wrapped in bandages. David quickly moved to the bed, his eyes reddening. What happened to you? Henry opened his eyes and saw his son, his gaze weary yet strong. David, he murmured, his voice hoarse. Don't worry about me. I've been through worse than this. David sat down beside the bed, holding his father's frail hand. No, Dad, this can't go on. They had no right to do this to you. I won't let this slide. That night, David spent most of his time beside his father's bed, listening to him and his neighbors recount the events of that day. The neighborhood residents had filmed the officers' attack on Henry, and David was horrified by the brutality. Watching the footage, David saw the 2 white officers stop his father in the street, begin interrogating him, and then search his belongings aggressively. When Henry protested, they not only mocked him but also used force to detain him. They threw him from his wheelchair, attacking him with no mercy. The anger in David's heart grew. This was more than just abuse of power, it was blatant discrimination. They had attacked his father not only because he was elderly and disabled, but also because he was black. David knew he couldn't let this go. I'm going to bring this case to light, David said to Henry, who had finally drifted into an exhausted sleep. I won't let them get away with this. David knew what he had to do next. He was no longer just a son protecting his father, he was a lawyer, a fighter for justice. He had fought against abuse of power for years, but this fight had now become deeply personal. David wouldn't just seek justice for his father, but for everyone who had ever been oppressed by unchecked power. And this time, he wouldn't stop until the truth was exposed. David didn't sleep all night. The images of his father being assaulted haunted his mind, fueling a rage he had never felt before. He had seen countless cases of abuse of power in the justice system, but now that his own father was the victim, everything had become personal. Early the next morning, David got up, his eyes ringed with exhaustion. He sat by his father's bed for a moment before he decided to take action. Henry was still in the hospital, though his health was showing slight improvement. His spirit, however, remained unbroken. Despite the pain, Henry's gaze was steadfast, looking at his son with pride and trust. Don't worry too much about me, Henry said gently. I'll be okay. David just shook his head, holding his father's hand tightly. No, Dad. I won't let them get away with this. I'll do everything I can to bring justice. With a deep breath, David left the hospital, taking one last look at his father. He knew he needed to act fast. David drove to the local police station, his mind steeled for the confrontation he knew would not be easy. He had led many investigations into corruption and abuse cases within the police force, but this case was different. It was personal. Inside the police station, David felt the tension in the air. He approached the front desk where a young officer was stationed. "I need to speak with the officers involved in the arrest of Mr. Henry Dawson," David stated bluntly. The officer glanced at him with a skeptical look. "Do you have an appointment?" David suppressed his frustration. "I don't need an appointment. I'm his son, and I need to meet the officers involved immediately." The young officer hesitated but eventually called over a superior. Moments later, the tall, bald officer who had assaulted his father appeared. David's heart raced as he looked the man in the eye. "We need to talk." The officer looked back, his gaze defiant. "Who are you?" "David Dawson, an attorney with the Department of Justice, and the son of Mr. Henry Dawson, the man you assaulted without cause." The officer's confidence wavered for a brief moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "That old man resisted arrest. We were following procedure." David clenched his fists, fighting to remain calm. "My father did nothing wrong. You and your colleague abused your authority and beat him without just cause." "You're slandering the police," the officer replied coldly. "We followed protocol. He didn't cooperate when we asked for his ID." David took a steadying breath, not breaking eye contact. Asking for ID from an elderly, disabled man solely based on his skin color is unreasonable. Even if there was a reason, you had no right to assault him like that. "I have video evidence from witnesses. If you think you're going to get away with this, you're wrong." The officer raised an eyebrow, a look of challenge in his eyes. "And what are you going to do? Sue us?" David stood tall, his gaze ice cold. "I'll do more than that. I'll make sure that you and your colleague not only lose your jobs but are held accountable under the law. I'll bring this case to the public, and we won't stop until justice is served." David's words left the officer momentarily speechless. His tone wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. David wasn't just any citizen, he was an attorney, a legal warrior used to facing off with those who abused their power. After leaving the police station, David immediately contacted his colleagues in the legal field, particularly those he had worked with on cases of police misconduct. He needed a strong team to launch this battle. David also reached out to human rights organizations willing to support cases of police brutality. He knew that only with widespread support and public pressure could he bring these offenders to justice. With the help of his colleagues and the witnesses from the incident, David began gathering evidence, preparing for the lawsuit. This wasn't just about his father, but about everyone who had been treated unjustly. This was a battle he was ready to fight. The hospital room was quiet, filled only with the steady beeping of the heart monitor and the soft breathing of Henry lying in bed. After hours in intensive care, the doctor finally allowed David to visit his father. David's eyes couldn't look away from the sight of Henry, the man he had always admired, lying motionless, his face bruised, arms and legs bandaged. Despite the fury roiling within him, David tried to remain calm. The doctor entered the room, holding the final test results. He was an elderly man with silver hair but had a professional and compassionate gaze. "How is my father?" Dr. David asked, his voice hoarse with worry. "Mr. Dawson is out of danger, but he has suffered several serious injuries," the doctor replied, flipping through the medical records. "He has 2 fractured ribs from a strong impact, and there's significant bruising on his shoulder and back. Our biggest concern was head trauma, but fortunately there's no sign of major brain damage. However, due to his age, recovery will be slower than for a younger person." David nodded quietly, relieved but pained, knowing his father had survived the danger, yet the physical injuries were only a fraction of what Henry had endured. Sitting by his father's bed, David's gaze was drawn to Henry's weary yet resolute face. In that moment, David remembered the stories his father had told him, the challenging life he had endured. Henry Dawson had been a young soldier full of passion when he enlisted to fight in the war. Though he rarely spoke about those years, David knew the battlefield had left indelible marks on his body and soul. After a serious accident on duty, Henry lost the ability to walk. Confined to a hospital bed for months, he faced the reality that he would never walk again. Yet, instead of succumbing to despair, he chose to rise above it mentally. Henry refused to let his disability break his spirit. Returning from war, he faced another battle against racial discrimination at home. Despite his sacrifices for his country, Henry was still marginalized due to his skin color. He was denied job opportunities, treated unfairly, and forced to live in a society where black people like him were looked down upon. Yet Henry held on to his pride. He never let anyone belittle him. He taught David, society may reject us, but the important thing is not to reject ourselves. A person's dignity and self-respect don't come from others but from within. Those lessons had been etched into David's soul. And now, as he sat there looking at his father, he understood that Henry had always been a strong man, even if age and disability had weakened him physically. Henry slowly opened his eyes, turning his head toward David. Though tired, there was still a determination in his gaze. "Dad," David started, his voice filled with pain and anger. "I'm sorry. I should have been here to protect you." Henry shook his head slightly, giving a faint smile. "No, David. You've always done your job well. I don't need anyone to protect me. I've survived worse." David lowered his head, struggling to keep his composure. "But they had no right to do this. I can't stand seeing you suffer this injustice." David, Henry said slowly, his voice still strong despite his frail body. "Injustice has always existed in this world. I've fought all my life, but do you know what makes me most proud?" David looked at his father, a question in his eyes. "It's you," Henry continued. "You are my greatest pride. I raised you to be someone who fights for justice, and now I know you won't stop. You'll do what I couldn't do in my lifetime." David was silent for a moment, feeling the weight of his father's words. He knew his father had endured things he couldn't even imagine. The scars Henry carried weren't just from this attack, they were from a life marked by injustice. "I won't let them get away with it," Dad, David said, his voice resolute. "I promise you. I'll fight for justice, for you and for everyone else who has been treated unjustly." Henry looked at his son, his gaze filled with trust, giving David all the motivation he needed to keep going. Despite his pain, Henry knew that this fight had now been handed over to his son, and he believed that David would bring everything to light. David spent most of that day by his father's side, but his mind was already on the next steps of the battle. His conversation with Henry had ignited a stronger resolve within him. This wasn't just about his father, it was about everyone like him. People who had been oppressed, denied their right to fair treatment. David decided that he wouldn't stop at filing a lawsuit against the officers who had attacked his father. He would bring this case to the public, rally human rights organizations and the media to ensure that this injustice wouldn't be ignored. It was time to expose the whole system of abuse, and he wouldn't stop until justice was served. The next morning, David's office was abuzz with tension. His desk was piled with files, documents about his father's case, but above all was his clear resolve. This wasn't just a personal lawsuit, but a battle against police abuse, a battle he had witnessed and fought for years. David sat in his chair, eyes fixed on the computer screen, displaying the video footage of his father being attacked. The brutal scenes filled him with a simmering rage, but he knew he had to control his emotions. This fight required not only strength but also legal precision. "David," a voice called from the doorway. It was Linda, his close colleague and one of the best lawyers he knew. She walked in with a stack of files, her gaze filled with determination. "I've reached out to a few human rights organizations, and they're ready to support us," Linda said, placing the files on David's desk. "They're very interested in this case and want to meet you to discuss legal strategies." David nodded, his eyes never leaving the screen. "Good. We'll need all the support we can get." Linda sat across from David, a hint of concern in her eyes. "But you know this won't be easy. Cases against the police are always complicated, especially with such strong internal protections." David looked up, meeting Linda's gaze directly. "I know. But this time, we have clear evidence. They can't cover up the truth forever, and I won't stop until my father's justice is served." Linda was silent for a moment, then nodded. "Then let's get started." David began assembling his legal team. Linda, who had stood by his side through countless cases, would be his main partner. Additionally, he reached out to trusted colleagues in the Department of Justice and NGOs that had experienced fighting police abuse. With strong connections in law and social justice, David easily gathered support. Everyone saw this case not only as an ordinary lawsuit but as an opportunity to push for systemic change. A week after his father's assault, David and his team filed a lawsuit against the two officers in the police department where they worked. This was the first step in a long legal battle, and David knew he had to be thoroughly prepared for every possible outcome. David understood that in order to secure justice, his father's case needed to be widely known. He contacted trusted journalists, providing them with the video footage. Within days, the footage went viral on social media, and major news outlets began covering Henry's case. Police brutality against a disabled man, the headlines blared across major newspapers. Public outrage exploded, with many calling for a thorough investigation into the department. David and his team held a press conference outside the hospital where Henry was being treated. In front of a sea of reporters, David declared that he would fight to the end to ensure justice, not just for his father but for everyone silenced by police abuse. "My father is a disabled man, but that does not make him a helpless victim," David stated to the gathered reporters. "We've grown too accustomed to hearing about police violence. But this cannot continue. Today, I stand here not only to defend my father's honor but also to protect the rights of all those who cannot speak up." The press conference ended with an outpouring of media and public support. Numerous human rights organizations publicly backed David, demanding that authorities swiftly investigate. As David's press conference gained attention, the police department where the two officers worked quickly responded. In a televised interview, a department representative attempted to downplay the incident, claiming that the officers followed proper procedures and that Henry was detained for showing resistance when asked for his ID. David wasn't surprised by the department's response. He knew the police would do everything to protect their own, even if it meant twisting the truth. But David was ready for this scenario. The evidence he held, from video footage to witness testimonies, would be the decisive blow in the upcoming trial. Over the following weeks, David and his legal team dedicated all their time to preparing for the trial. They analyzed every detail in the video, gathered more testimonies from witnesses, and worked with legal experts to ensure every aspect of the case was meticulously prepared. David knew that winning this case wouldn't be easy. The legal system often sided with the police, and proving they abused their power while on duty was a huge challenge. However, David held a powerful weapon: the truth. And he believed that with clear evidence and public support, he could bring those who attacked his father to justice. One evening, while preparing documents for the trial, David received an unexpected call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was deep, almost ominous. "David Dawson." "Yes, this is he. Who's calling?" David replied, feeling a wave of tension. "I have information about the two officers who assaulted your father. I think you'll want to hear it." David immediately straightened up. "Who are you? And what information do you have?" The man refused to reveal his identity, but what he shared shocked David. According to this source, the two officers weren't newcomers to cases of misconduct and violence. Reports had been filed against them before, but somehow everything had been swept under the rug. It seemed as though a powerful force was protecting them. "Do you want proof?" the cold voice asked. "I want everything you have," David replied, realizing this fight was more complex than he had imagined. The call ended, leaving David in a state of confusion but with renewed resolve. This case wasn't just about his father anymore. It was unveiling dark truths about a corrupted system, and David knew he would have to fight harder than ever. The day of the first official court hearing arrived sooner than David had expected. The sky was gray, with a hint of autumn chill, but that didn't dampen the fire of determination burning in his heart. This was the most critical day of his fight, not only to bring justice for his father, but to expose the police system that had protected abusers for years. David was fully aware of the dangers around him. The threats from faceless foes were now a glaring reality, but there was no turning back. He had come too far to stop now. If there was one thing he'd learned from his father, it was courage standing up for justice, even when the road was treacherous. Outside the courthouse, hundreds of protesters gathered, creating two opposing tides. One side was filled with supporters of David and his family chanting for justice and police reform. The other side, supporting the police, held signs against David, accusing him of tarnishing the police force's reputation. David looked out the courthouse window, sensing the division within society. This only strengthened his resolve to reveal the truth. This battle wasn't just about his father, it was about a system he was determined to help change. The courtroom was packed, with reporters from all over in attendance. Major news networks were broadcasting live, and millions of people were watching every second of the proceedings. David and his team sat at the plaintiff's table, surrounded by files, evidence, and carefully prepared strategies. Across the aisle sat the two officers, his father's assailants, alongside their legal team, who wore confident expressions. But David could see the worry behind their eyes. They knew that this time they would face undeniable evidence. The arguments began. David and his team presented new evidence unearthed by the internal investigation. The reports showed that these two officers had been involved in multiple similar incidents in the past but were shielded by their superiors in the police department. Independent investigations from the Department of Justice had revealed that the system had repeatedly covered up such misconduct. David rose, addressing the jury with conviction. What we see today is not just the abuse of power by two individuals. This is the product of an opaque and irresponsible system where those who abuse their power go unpunished. But today we are here to change that. We are here to prove that justice must prevail and that no one, whether police officer or citizen, stands above the law. He went on to present the video footage, investigative reports, and witness testimonies, dismantling the facade the officers and their defense team had built. Testimonies from witnesses like Marge and others who had witnessed the assault strengthened the video evidence. The officers' defense team, as usual, tried to blame Henry. They continued to argue that he had resisted and that the use of force was necessary to maintain order. They attempted to downplay the evidence, claiming the video footage had been edited or taken out of context. The tall officer who had attacked Henry took the stand, maintaining a calm demeanor, his every word carefully prepared to protect himself. He claimed that Henry had refused to cooperate, declined to show his ID, and acted in a threatening manner, leaving them no choice but to act. David listened, never taking his eyes off the officer. He knew the man was lying, but proving the truth within a system that was inherently biased was no small feat. Finally, as the trial reached its closing arguments, David stepped forward, addressing the judge and jury. "We have heard a lot in this trial," David began, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. "The defense has tried to obscure the truth, portraying my father as defiant, forcing the officers to act. But what we see in the footage is an irrefutable truth. Henry Dawson was not a threat. He was simply a man on his way home, brutally abused without justification." David turned to the jury, his gaze sweeping over each member. "We cannot accept a society where people like my father and elderly, disabled black men are treated as criminals just because they look different. We need justice, not only for my father but for everyone who has ever been abused by those sworn to protect us." He returned to his seat, his heart pounding. Everything was now in the hands of the jury. After the arguments concluded, the jury left the room to deliberate and reach a verdict. David and his team sat in silence, knowing that everything was now out of their control. Time passed slowly, each second stretching into eternity. In David's mind, images of his father lying in the hospital came vividly to life. Henry had survived the injuries, but what he had endured was a testament to the injustice so many others also faced. Finally, the door opened. The jury returned, and the judge asked everyone to stand. The room grew tense as the head juror stood up, holding the final decision. The judge spoke. "The jury has reached a verdict, and their decision is..." David held his breath, the silence in the room stifling. "Guilty on all charges." The courtroom erupted with emotion. People stood, cheering and crying in relief. The verdict had arrived, and justice had been served. The two officers were found guilty of abuse of power and assault, and the local police system would have to answer to the public. David remained in his seat, feeling a wave of relief and joy wash over him. He knew his fight had succeeded, and his father, along with countless others, had finally received justice. After the trial, David walked out of the courthouse to the cheers of supporters. Outside, a crowd awaited him. Many came to embrace him, thanking him for fighting for justice, not only for his father but for the entire community. David went to the hospital, where his father was recovering. Henry had heard the news from the TV in his room, and when he saw David walk in, he smiled gently. "Dad, we won," David said, his voice thick with emotion. Henry looked at his son, his eyes glistening with tears. "You did it, David. You did what I always dreamed of. I'm proud of you." David held his father's hand, feeling a deep connection stronger than ever. This battle was not only about seeking justice for his father but a significant step toward changing the system, and he knew he wouldn't stop here. The fight for justice, for equality, would go on. Looking out the window, the sunlight streamed through the trees, signaling a brighter future. A future where justice would always prevail,